Refugee Action. First, I just wanted to thank all three of you and British Futures for organising this incredibly helpful thing to be able to do so quickly. Last time we were in this room, both Ryan and Sundar were speaking before the referendum about the scenarios. And for me, the central issue in the debate was the prediction from Ryan, which I think all of us recognise, that if Leave won, that they would move back into the centrist territory that you've been articulating, but a view from a lot of other people in the room that in engineering that win, they would unleash a lot of anti-immigration feeling because of the way that they ran their campaign. And we can see that happening right now on the ground. And so when the gentleman next to me says, well, will a new party emerge? A new party has emerged. It's called UKIP. And my concern is now we're immediately seeing a sort of consensus emerge that, well, we still want to be in the single market and so on. My concern is that, first of all, there are events on the ground that, there is a licence to anti-racism, that the police are going to have to step up, and there's a lot of issues about how you provide reassurance on the ground. And I think that's a really important part that I think for everybody to be talking about. And my second concern is that if we get a deal of the kind that we're talking about, which seems incredibly likely, then you're going to straight away get UKIP saying, well, this was a denial of the will of the 70 million, and particularly obviously in the areas that voted Leave, another surge in the UKIP vote. And that would be my fear about where it's going.
Kane. Yeah.
Right, this isn't about refugees, so I can leave it for the next round if you just want to talk about refugees for now.
Maybe let's park it to the next round, and you'll be first. Mary.
I mean, mine isn't about refugees either, but it hooks very well onto onto the previous question, which is that, I mean, I did find some of your answers a bit complacent and a bit over-optimistic, I think. And really, my questions go exactly to those same 2 points. To my mind, a large percentage of the 17 million who voted for Leave did so on migration, and they got a mixed message from the Leave campaign. And what they took from it was not that it was just take control; it was that it would be less. And it seems to me that if this is turned around by Boris and co to be something about sovereignty rather than about immigration, then we're in for big trouble. And the same thing about basically the voting system and the political parties. I don't actually think it's good enough to sort of sit there and say, well, it's all very nice because for each party to have a sort of middle of the road. Because the results of the last election that gave UKIP 1 seat in return for all those votes, that has now been highlighted as how unrepresentative the system is. And I think with the meltdown of the mismatch between the Parliamentary Labour Party and the Labour Party in the country, we're seeing something much bigger going on.
Okay, maybe Sundar.
Yeah, I think these are important points. My own view is it wouldn't be sensible, I think, in the long term, to try and keep free movement having voted to leave the European Union. I think we might keep it for a while, we might keep quite a bit of it because we might go slowly, but I think if we're going to maintain consent for immigration, we're going to not have to say, sorry, you've got to like Olympics as part of the deal. We're going to have to take the public through what they want to keep and what they don't want to keep, at which point you bring out the sense that, actually, about 10% of the public are properly racist and open to admitting to it. So that's a large enough group of people in our society. And about a quarter of people would just stop immigration if they could. And then, 2/3 of people would reduce it, but keep all the good bits, but reduce it and control it, deal with pressures and so on. And, that's a really sensible position, but people have to go through what that means when they want students, they want health workers, they want lower levels. We've got to make those choices. But it's really important that the Leave campaign put in the box people who do think it's been a vote for anti-migrant xenophobia or saying to people in the street that go home. That's why I think the position from the government that migrants can stay is important. Also just messaging about the fact that this stuff's going to be policed very assertively, very aggressively, and you haven't got if you think you've got a license for hate speech in our society because we've had a democratic vote, then your license should be revoked. If you cross the line into advocating violence, you should be banged up. The 17 million Leave votes, about 4 million of them are UKIP, half of whom have got really tough views, actually half of whom have got quite moderate views. About 3 million of them are Labour. Just a real sense of economic anxiety there. About 1 million of them, I think, are SNP as well. And most of them are Tories in this manage, control and have it. But we had an awful lot of offers of immigration policy from Nigel Farage was net 50,000, his only immigration spokesman was net 250,000. So we haven't had that debate. That was not decided by this referendum. We're going to have to find a way to decide it. I think there will be, by the way, a party of open, the Liberal Democrats on 10% or 15%. I think there'll be a party of closed on 15 or 20% that will always be unhappy. It will just have to find a new thing to blame. You know, it can blame Westminster now, not Brussels. But I think it's so important to have parties that aren't like, we're for open and if you're for closed, we're looking forward to you dying. Or, if you drink latte, you're not a real person. We need parties that actually, want to represent the common ground in our country. And I think, the Conservatives will probably be a moderate Eurosceptic stay out party, but they should be trying to represent both parts of that divide.
Yeah, I think the word that was used was unleashed, and I think again that sort of presumes that these views weren't already there. We just didn't necessarily hear them as vociferously as we might be doing now. And I think if you just look around the world, look at the rest of Europe, that 20% that Sundar talks about is in every country. I mean, every member state of the European Union has that block of opinion. And the UK, why should we be any different? I think that exists. The question is, how do you manage it? And I think this point about mixed messages, well, I mean, what is more mixed than what the Remain campaign was putting forward, or just our politics in general was putting forward?
Just to be clear, I wasn't defending the Remain campaign. That's not.
No.
I agree with a lot of the points.
This is a bigger point. I'm just saying. I think that 20% of people are there. We have to deal with that. It's just a point about mixed messages. That is, yes, they're coming from the Leave campaign, but they're actually on immigration. Our whole politics has been a complete mixed message, because we've been telling people that we can reduce immigration to a level which no one believes is credible, and basically all political parties have connived in that message. And we're doing it in a way that basically it can only exacerbate the problem, because the OBR is going around saying we're going to have immigration of 180,000, which again I still can't quite believe how we're going to get down to 180,000, let alone under 100,000. So how can we possibly reassure people that we are investing, preparing the country to deal with this population change, not just immigration? How can we convince people that is being dealt with if we're denying the problem exists? So I think the idea that this mixed message thing is a much broader problem, and if you're going to be an optimist, my hope would be, as sort of Ryan I think hinted at and Sundar, is that this actually is an opportunity to level with people on lots of issues, immigration being one of them, what the European Union actually was, which is again not just an economic project but a geopolitical one. And there may be other issues that we have to be more honest about in our politics. And that actually is a way to actually co-opt some of the more moderate views on some of these things and articulate them in a way that is more sensible. But I think the immigration one is evidence of kind of, if you tell people one thing that they just no one believed it was going to happen. And at the same time you were saying, well, we're not going to build the hospitals, roads, schools, because this isn't a problem. I mean, that's not a coherent message, and I think that's, again, understandable why people reacted against that.
Yeah, so to Stephen's point about sort of unleashing racism, I have seen some in the newspapers, some incidents which are troubling and must be condemned, and I think it's important, particularly on those on the Leave side, to condemn that. But I also think it's important for us liberal cosmopolitans to not say there's been a massive unleashing because of people voting Leave. I think most people's concern about immigration, as British Future and we've shown, is about management, it's not about racism. So I think there are isolated incidents and there are people who are using the vote to do such activity, but I think it's important to condemn that and say the majority of people who went for Leave don't condone that sort of thing. So that's the first thing. Second, on a kind of new party and the sort of shifts in the sand. Well, remember we had another referendum on the electoral system, and overwhelmingly it was rejected. And that was at a time when the Lib Dems had come into, they're the third party, they've got loads of votes, but they don't have as many seats. And actually, a lot of those Lib Dem voters then shifted, weirdly, to UKIP in the 2015 election. So, the public have been given a choice on the electoral system, which would have quite significant changes, I think, to how political parties position themselves, but they rejected that. I think I think on immigration, I think there's two trends to look for. The economy, which is probably going to have a hit, that probably will have quite a substantial effect on net migration levels in the years ahead. The economy seems to be the main driver, I think, of European migration, and if the British economy goes down, then we may see a reduction as a result of that. The second, though, which works in the other way, the force that works the other way, is around migrants coming here before the deal is done. And before we get out, and a lot of people raise the issue from the Remain side that we may see quite a substantial increase in migration flows before Brexit is done, signed, sealed and delivered. So there's the two trends to watch out for there, but my suspicion is actually the economy, and if it does go through a bad patch, will lead to a reduction in net migration. I think the final thing I want to say is about the kind of narrative that we're seeing around the elite versus the people. And I think this is a narrative that has become very persuasive, not only in this country, but in America, where we've seen the kind of rise of Trumpism. And this, I think, is the new narrative which is taking hold. I find it troubling because I find it quite anti-meritocratic, but also quite divisive. It's blaming people on high incomes and good jobs for difficulties. And I think people who are in positions of power, particularly politicians, have got to find a way of responding to this elite versus people narrative, because at the moment they're indulging in it and it's worsening it. And it's very divisive, and it's creating a gap in trust between politicians and people. And I think that's the new narrative that democratic politicians, particularly centrist politicians, have to deal with. I don't have the answers, but I think that's a major political narrative now that we're facing.
Just want to come back on immigration and just things we can learn from why Remain struggled so much on it in the campaign. I think they made three big errors. Firstly, conventional campaign theory says try never to talk about the things that you're weak on and people are worried about you on, because you want to talk about things you're strong on. And just changing the subject on immigration is really corrosive, because people just think you can't even answer a question about it. You always go and talk about something else. My concerns about it will never be dealt with. You just don't care about them. So you've got to stop changing the subject, even if it's uncomfortable. You've got to deal with it. Secondly, they had a credible message. The other side won't be able to cut it to these levels. There's no magic wand, leaving the EU isn't a magic wand. But then the Prime Minister and Home Secretary said, but we can cut it to those levels without leaving. So we've got a really magic wand. So that people then just getting very annoyed that they're saying something so obviously untrue, and therefore don't hear the correct message that the other side won't cut it. And then thirdly, their message was supposed to be, they've got no magic wand, they won't be able to reduce it a lot. And instead of saying the decent, right, honest thing, which is, the EU migrants will stay, they were forever saying they'll be kicking out nurses, they'll be kicking people out of care homes, your football teams will have no footballers. Now, they are all messages that say they'll have slashed immigration enormously and in horrible ways, yet your message was supposed to be it's much more difficult than you think. So I think it was an absolute jumble. And it all goes back to this issue of making a promise you can't keep and then being too stubborn to change it. So you've got to get on to keepable promises and slowly rebuilding trust.
Okay, let's have another round of questions, and you're first, and then Marley, and I'm sorry I don't know your name, but yeah, okay.
Hi, I'm Mark English from the European Commission's London office. First of all, I'd like to reassure you or frighten you that we're not yet in mothballs. Yeah. And in fact, you might actually see a bit more of us than you did during your campaign. There are no murder rules, but now everybody will be back out speaking on panels. So my question is actually not on behalf of the Commission. There's been a lot of talk about immigration. This debate in this room has been dominated by immigration. And you're picking up on something that Sundar said. We're talking about people who are concerned about control in the majority, and yet who are not racist or xenophobic. Does that suggest that immigration is in fact, fears over it, in part at least, a proxy for another fear, which is a fear about job security? And in that context, something Stephen Briggs said really leapt out of me, that we will have to work harder for our economic growth in the future, and that could mean more labour flexibility. But isn't labour flexibility one of the reasons why many among the less advantaged people in our country actually voted to leave? and would not more of it just pour fuel on the fire and indeed tie in with the dangerous issues that could arise over immigration as well.
Okay, Marley.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to ask about this fundamental question around access to the single market and free movement. And I mean, to me, I'm interested to see what the panel think, but to me, it seems that this choice is going to be made fairly binary by the EU, because the EU, I think, are going to strike a very hard bargain with the UK, and they're going to make us squirm a bit, and they're basically going to say, look, you can have full access to the single market, and that means passporting rights, but that means you have to be part of the EEA, and that means you have to accept free movement and everything that goes with that. Or a free trade agreement that means sacrificing passporting rights. And that's going to be, I would have thought, a very tough dilemma. In particular, I would have thought, for the Conservative Party, because I imagine there's a kind of big strain of the Conservative Party that is sort of, that really feels that it needs to protect the city, and that this is a kind of fundamental kind of driving force behind kind of conservative ideology. So I would have thought this is a huge challenge for the Conservatives. In a way, it might not be such a challenge for Labour, but I don't know. The Labour's going through the same problem, I guess. I suppose the question is, A, do you think that's a massive challenge, or B, do you think there is some kind of compromise? I mean, Daniel Hannan kind of pointed to a potential offer of free movement of labour without any of the other extra bits. Is that really on offer, or something like, or could a deal be done where there is no free movement, there are controls, but the EU citizens are prioritised in some way? Is there a compromise, or is it really going to be a binary choice?
Hi, I'm Kim from Britain Thinks, and also a Belgian national. So I'm going to ask one question as someone from Britain Thinks and the other as a Belgian. The first one is, Cindy, you touched on sort of lessons that can be learned in terms of how we talk about immigration. But I'm wondering sort of what lessons do you think can be learned on sort of how to engage with young people, because that's been an issue of sort of how to engage young people in voting and in politics. But I don't think either campaign sort of doesn't seem like they learned any lessons from the previous election on how to engage them, and we saw that from turnout of young people, and I think that has sort of some serious repercussions for the public mood, because we saw that also 75% of 18 to 24-year-olds voting for Remain. So how do we sort of engage young people and also mean that the result that we're left with now, how do we sort of always build that divide that's been created between the younger generation and the older generation? And as a Belgian, what do you think we'll actually see in terms of the movement of Europeans? So you obviously, Cindy, you also mentioned sort of what needs to be said and what kind of rhetoric needs to be